Welcome to Healthcare du Jour, where we dish up and digest the latest in healthcare. For the next 30 minutes, sit back as we bring you insight, commentary, and discussion on trending topics to the table, all expertly served up by our host and his guests. Now here's your host, Matt Fisher.
Welcome back, and thank you for joining as we dive into the hottest topics in healthcare. I'm your host, Matt Fisher. On the menu today is Tim Darling, co-founder and president at Laudio Insights. Tim, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks for having me.
So, Tim, what I always like to do before getting into the main part of the conversation is to give my guests a chance to provide more of an introduction in terms of who they are and what they do. So, Tim, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, I'll keep it brief, but yes, as you say, I'm one of the co-founders of Laudio, which is a software platform dedicated to elevating the work of frontline managers in healthcare. And Laudio Insights is about 9 months old. It is our objective thought leadership platform where we publish what we're learning from our data and the conversations that we have with the health systems that we serve. So that's what I'm up to nowadays, and that's I think how we got connected.
So, Tim, I'm always curious also to know how my guests first got into healthcare. So, kind of what was your journey into healthcare?
Well, yeah, it's a simple one. About 15 years ago, as a strategy consultant, I showed up for the first day of work and was assigned to work in a health system. And I realized at that moment I had a lot to learn. Well, I stuck with it, and here we are 15 years later. I still have a lot to learn, but I've developed a focus in serving the frontline leaders and executives and health systems in the U.S.
Yeah, no, I think that's personal bias. I think that's a great way into the industry because that's pretty similar to my own story, which is showed up at my first day of work and started giving assignments in healthcare, and kind of like you developed that passion around it.
So much is just a little bit of luck here and there changes everything, doesn't it?
Oh, definitely. And so I know you said kind of a newer role that you've taken on is doing some thought leadership and analyzing what you're learning from the data that you're collecting. So what are some of the primary issues that you've been focusing on recently?
Well, nurse burnout has been one that we've been working on for many, many years. I know one of the topics that we'll be talking about today. I think that we've been, in terms of thought leadership in some of our publications over the last 6 months, have been focused on two areas. One is what type of trends and insights from our data can we bring to health system executives to help them make decisions and prioritize some of their own time and resources. The second line of work has been to support frontline leaders themselves, and we are working on a book and a series of materials for release later this year on that second item.
So I guess maybe before getting into what you say is some of the ways to potentially address, what are you seeing as kind of the drivers or underlying factors that are contributing to burnout among nurses?
It's real, and there's a few different ways you can measure it. The way that we measure it in some of the work that we've been doing, and also wrote a paper, and the way that we've measured in that was to talk about role overload. And this is a framework that has three parts. One of them is role conflict. So that's when there's competing requirements and responsibilities. We can talk a little bit about what that means. Second is role ambiguity. That just means not having predictable or certainty in your scheduling or your life when you show up for work. And the third is the overload of work, not having enough time to do what you are trying to complete. And that leads to people staying late, skipping breaks. And it's usually a combination of two or three of these three things that systemically leads to burnout, feelings of burnout.
So when you're kind of looking at each of those different factors, what are some of the signs that they're occurring, and what are some of the consequences beyond, I think, as you said, of staying late and missing breaks, when you identify that those factors are in place? Yeah.
Well, I mentioned a paper, so I'll just do a shout out for that. It was Simi King, the CNIO of Children's National Hospital in Washington, D.C., and Maggie Fink and myself published this paper a few months ago, which is really focused on this very topic, which is what are the indicators and early indicators of burnout and what can you do about them? And, give a few examples. For example, within role ambiguity, that's the idea that I don't have certainty or predictability in my work. So in the world of nursing, for example, that might mean somebody who shows up for work in their typical ICU floor and is asked, because the ICU isn't as busy that day, they asked to go work on a different floor. That level of uncertainty can lead to burnout, as can great variations in the acuity or the types of patients that you're serving. And then there's other aspects of that, such as, am I being asked to teach and train younger nurses? Am I being asked to do sort of certain leadership responsibilities that are inconsistent? And then in the other areas, role overload, I mentioned staying late, having to come in early, skipping breaks. These are good indicators. They are both indicators and they're also symptoms. And role conflict, if I'm just being asked to do things where maybe I'm just being asked to do 2 or 3 different things as a leader and as a frontline team member at the same time. And so I have this constant conflict with prioritization and how I spend my time and if I'm able to do justice to all the different roles.
And kind of as you're describing those, it seems like, for better or for worse, it might be easy for those issues to kind of increase in severity over time just through creep and natural accretion. And it might be hard to spot as it's happening on a day-to-day basis. So are there ways that as you were going through the data of being able to, maybe catch it earlier on so that way you can head off the problem before it kind of balloons?
Yes, that's right. So a lot of the work that we've done over the last 7 years in our own platform has been to create these constant review of daily operational data, finding themes and bringing those themes in a prioritized way to the attention of the frontline leaders. That's one way of doing it. But you're right. One of the reasons this is so challenging is that frontline leaders in these health systems today have so many responsibilities of their own. They have extremely large spans of control teams, and the time and ability for them to be paying attention to every single one of their team members on all these different potential dimensions is very limited. So that's one of the reasons why solutions become a very complex. The topic itself is very complex. And I think that the solutions have to come from a system-wide thinking, that this is not something that individual nurses themselves often could probably solve, or frontline leaders themselves without support, without certain levels of tools can solve. That this is something that health system leaders have to find system solutions for.
Yeah, and that definitely makes sense because as you're saying, it can't just be an individualized solution. It has to be, you need buy-in and support and drive for change from the broader system. So I guess maybe before turning to that piece of it of, exploring, how can burnout begin to be addressed? It's, I guess maybe getting arguably down to that individual level, how are nurses identifying the burnout or factors that are driving it that might be different from what the system is seeing?
One of the challenges is that for an individual team member, burnout is something that people feel, but it is not something that we've really well articulated. And often, for example, for a new nurse, they often are very ambitious. They might volunteer to pick up additional shifts to help out the team. They might have some challenges with time management that cause them to stay late, but not notice it being a trend and not really think about some of the implications on themselves or their own wellness. And so some things that end up being positive, rising because of positive intent, end up a few months later becoming a detriment to their own health and wellness and creep up on them without real recognition. So that's one of the reasons why I do believe this is a system level challenge. And part of that system level solution is articulating what this is, what the different components are, what are some of the ways that we can measure and look for early indicators as individuals, as managers, and as organizations.
Yeah, that raises, a good insight, which is, it's, arguably increased feelings or increased causes of burnout might play upon the natural inclination of wanting to do more and wanting to do everything you can to help the good delivery of care and helping out patients. But I think kind of implicit in what you said is at times that can be detrimental to the person who's actually delivering the care because it's not allowing that break or not allowing that clear definition of role that kind of can have a snowball effect.
Yeah. Well, one way to think about it is at its simplest, burnout is the tension between what you are willing and able to do and what you're being asked to do over time. So any given day, the tension is a bit of stress. But when you can't leave it behind and when it builds up day by day over time, then it reduces your willingness and your capabilities to do the work that you want to do. And as I say, without reasonable articulation of some of the underlying causes, it becomes a bit of a phantom challenge. And I think that's where we are right now, which is finding frameworks and structures to talk about, what the contributors are, how to look out for them. And that might well be a first step before applying some of the solutions.
Yeah, and kind of maybe digging a little bit more into the, how are you finding the indicators? What are some of the sources of data that you were looking at that led you to, finding the indicia of, the conflict or that role ambiguity or the role overload?
Well, the work that we've done has been based on operational data and health systems. We're lucky our platform pulls data daily from these different platforms such as time and attendance, medical record data, scheduling data, and so on. So we actually get these daily real-time perspectives on where people are working, when they're working, and some of the work that they're doing. That's a view on this, and that's some of what, when we wrote this paper, we were suggesting that these are reasonably available data sources that others can look to as well. There are other ways that you can measure role ambiguity, for example, or role conflict with different data systems, but we've found a lot of value in reasonably straightforward ones, such as people leaving late. That tells you an awful lot. It might not tell you exactly why, but it certainly tells you that if it's systemic, it's something that needs to be discussed, and whatever the underlying causes are, whether they be individual or some function of the team and how the team operates, would best be solved early, because they're the type of things that over time can contribute to a burnout of the individual team member.
Yeah, and I think that's a great reminder, which, as you said, it doesn't necessarily have to be complex or deep data points. It can be very, I think, as you said, simple pieces of information that begin to construct that puzzle. So it seems like one of the points that you're helping to raise is it's start with the obvious and don't just try to look for hidden or hard to find data, but start with some kind of simple foundational blocks. And then it sounds like that will begin to really help you construct and build meaningful insight.
Yeah. Almost all organizations do some form of a survey of their team members about their feelings of burnout. So that's baseline level. Where is it a problem? To what degree is it a problem? That's quite typical. The next question, which is, what are some of the underlying reasons for it? How do we get ahead of it? How can we see indicators that might predict it appearing a few weeks or a few months in the future? Is, I would propose, the next place to be thinking. And as you say, I don't think we need to be overly complex about it. Some of these things that I've talked about, some of these fields, they take a fair amount of work when you're thinking about how do you measure them and make them easy to act on for every given manager, for all of the different team members on a regular basis. I mean, that is real work, but the data is available, and there are creative ways that you can start to make some progress in putting that data to use.
Yeah, and putting data to use seems to be arguably constant challenge for healthcare. And for those of you just joining, I'm talking with Tim Darling from Laudio Insights. We've been talking about kind of indicators and causes for burnout. And Tim, one of the last points you were just talking about is going from mining existing data to starting to find predictors to start to drive change. So it's as systems hopefully become more adept at finding those predictors, what are some of the ways that you're seeing or that you would suggest to start driving positive change that can alleviate some of those factors that are driving burnout?
Well, from the conversations I've had with frontline managers, there's a lot of underlying causes behind some of these indicators. And the conversations aren't always easy, but if you're past the first step of just general awareness of where to how much and to what degree burnout is a challenge, if you're thinking about the second stage of how do we identify certain indicators for each individual employee and raise them in some prioritized way to the frontline manager to act on, the third step is how do you have those conversations? How do you begin to solve some of the causes of those indicators? And there can be many reasons for it. Some of them, and I think the solutions really depend on the reasons. So in the example we talked about earlier, if the challenge is a very new person joining the team, being very ambitious, you might want to have a conversation that recognizes that, appreciates that, and says, why don't we work together to be a bit more balanced, because I want you here in 6, 12, 18 months. It could be a very positive conversation. On the other hand, it could be someone who'd been here for quite some time and is still skipping breaks just because that's been the team norm. And everyone does it, and I do it, we all do it. And I think the solution there is different. The solution is actually talking to the entire team about this isn't actually the norm that we want, and that's going to be the exception, and we're going to be paying attention to it. And even though it might always be done for good intent, it's not how we're going to be doing things going forward. And then you might after that keep an eye on individuals and have individual conversations as follow-ups. And then one other example, in the world of role ambiguity, for example, people showing up for work and not having a predictable environment. The patients that they serve might be different. The people that they work with might be different. The places and the floors that they're asked to work on might be different. That causes stress, which leads to burnout. And the solutions there will be different as well. But and there are many types of solutions there, from how do we try to have the same people working together on the same shifts. That could be a scheduling difference. Can we set it up so that the patient transport and the environmental services teams that work with my Tuesday day shift are generally the same people every Tuesday, and that could be working with other managers to establish schedules that work together. So there could be many, many different solutions to that. But even simple things like that start to bring a sense of predictability and consistency. That starts to reduce role ambiguity. So I think, again, I'll come back to the original thought. The more we are able to articulate and discuss the different components, and the more that individual frontline leaders can probably begin to disentangle and make progress on individual components.
And that description appears to build off of what you were saying earlier, that addressing and improving the circumstances to hopefully start reducing and eliminating burnout as much as possible. That's really a system-wide issue, as I believe what you were saying earlier. And kind of based on what you were just describing with those examples, that makes sense now, because it's each individual frontline manager might help to identify one or two of the elements contributing to burnout, but you're going to need that broader system perspective to kind of connect the different dots. And then kind of taking that example of the role ambiguity where you want to try to have the same people scheduled together, to have even different service lines scheduled together, so that way you have consistency. Is it fair to say that like one individual frontline manager might not see all those pieces, but if they can feed that information to the broader system, the system can compile all of that and then use that to feed a more positive cycle?
There's the way that burnout first came about was bottom up in terms of conversation and solutioning. And I think top down is far more effective, which is not to say that everybody at the top has all the answers, but to give you an example of what I mean, during COVID, there was a lot of talk about, say, yoga or breathing exercises and things like that for frontline managers who were experiencing burnout. Well, the downside of that is it implicitly puts a lot of the responsibility of the challenge and the solution on the frontline team member. Well, I think the more powerful approach is to start at the top, as we've been talking about, to define this challenge, what it means, to look at the different tools and solutions that could be applied and the conversations that can be had across the organization, to empower the frontline managers to be able to work with their teams members, and then the team members themselves. They have a responsibility, but it's sort of their responsibility is under the umbrella of the work their managers are doing and their organization is doing, and an acknowledgement that these are system challenges. Even though individuals may have contributions to them, the system challenges have to be raised and solved first. So I think that's partly a perception difference, but a lot of the solutions that are going to have real impact have to start with a definition, data, tools, platforms that have to be, as you say, thought out and implemented within the organization first, and then others can build from them with local conversations and apply them locally.
Yeah, it also feels like, as part of that perception, it's thinking broadly about, like what are all the different contributing factors, as opposed to, with your example, which kind of goes along with, some anecdotal stories that I've heard of, call it maybe token efforts made to address, burnout by, doing something that appears to be, stress alleviating, or, trying to introduce more fun into something, but, is really a one-off that, even if it seems like it could be helpful, might actually just inadvertently contribute, because now it's just a different activity that isn't actually paying attention to the real systemic stressors that exist and are feeding into and causing the burnout.
Yeah, if as a frontline team member, all I see are events or initiatives that are largely things that I have to do, or seem to be about things that I need to be a part of to solve this, it sends the message implicitly and perhaps accidentally that it's an individual challenge. Whereas if you say, as an organization, we recognize these are systemic forces, and there are systemic forces that are making the world and the lives of these team members and managers far more complex than they were 5-10 years ago. We're going to start there. We're going to put these things in place as an organization. We're going to give these tools to your frontline managers. Your managers are going to make changes to staffing, scheduling within, and so on, within their own realm. And then they're going to have individual conversations with you about some of the things you can do. It's an entirely different perception of what I'm hearing. And it might be that there's the after work softball game on Fridays actually takes on new meaning from being the one thing that we do to try to solve, quote unquote, solve burnout, in which case it sort of feels like it falls flat, to being one of the myriad of things that are being done at multiple levels, in which case it might feel like, I see how this fits into a broader strategy to solve all different angles. And if this particular angle is relevant for me, I'll be part of it. And if it's not the only thing that's going on. And that, I think that perception, that communication is very important.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And as you just said, having a myriad of different approaches in place, intuitively makes a lot of sense because, most solutions in the real world don't have just one simple answer to it. It's usually a series of different actions or a series of different new measures or processes that are put into place that, when they accumulate, have that benefit as opposed to, you know, eh, while people might love to have that kind of silver bullet that addresses an issue, it's tough to see that actually happening in the real world. So it's, I really liked your description that it's, when you put a lot of different forces into play, all of a sudden it might change perception around, one of them, because now it becomes actually something that is a way to kind of turn off and, um, you know, just relax and have fun, as opposed to just feeling like, oh, this is being thrown out there as, a false flag of how the underlying problem is actually being addressed.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right.
Believe it or not, we are already out of time. I want to thank my guest, Tim Darling, for a great conversation today.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for having me.
And thank you to everyone listening. Keep the dialogue going and connect with me at hashtag HCDEJURE. I'm Matt Fisher. Until next time.